After my husband's funeral, I came home feeling like the world had turned down its sound. The voices, the prayers, the soft hands on my shoulders. Everything stayed behind me like a fog as I walked up our quiet street. Our house stood at the end of the lane with its pale walls and small garden, the same place where Daniel used to stand barefoot on summer mornings, watering the plants and smiling like life was simple. I held my keys tightly, because that small metal weight was the only thing that still felt normal. When I reached the front door, my key refused to turn. I tried again, slower this time, then harder, thinking my hands were still shaking too much. But the lock looked new, shiny and unfamiliar, like it had been placed there to erase me. A cold line formed in my stomach. I leaned closer, staring at it as if it might explain itself, but it stayed silent. Then the door opened from inside, and the truth stepped into the light. Mark, Daniel's brother, stood in the doorway with a toolbox on the floor beside him. Behind him, Daniel's mother, Margaret, watched me like I was an unwanted guest, not a grieving wife. Daniel's father, Richard, hovered near the hallway, his face stiff and distant. Two relatives I barely knew, Helen and Peter, carried cardboard boxes past the stairs, already filling them with my things. My books, my framed photos, even the scarf I always hung by the door. The house smelled the same, but the air felt changed, as if someone had taken my name off every room. Margaret didn't offer a greeting or a single kind word. She just lifted her chin and spoke like she was announcing a rule that could not be questioned. "Blood family only," she said coldly. "Your time here is over." I stood still, my black dress brushing my knees, my heart pounding in my ears. I watched them tape boxes shut as if my life could be packed away in minutes, and something inside me went very quiet. I looked straight at Margaret and said, "You forgot one thing." They didn't move at first, not even Mark with the screwdriver still in his hand. My words hung in the air, small but heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret's face stayed hard, yet her eyes narrowed as if she was trying to measure me. Richard shifted his weight, impatient, and Helen stopped taping a box mid-strip. Peter pretended to look busy, but I saw his fingers tighten around the cardboard edge. Everyone was waiting for me to break, to beg, to cry, to do something that would make their cruelty feel justified. Instead, I took a slow breath and stepped fully inside the house. "This is not a conversation," Margaret said, her voice sharp enough to cut. "You need to take your things and go." I looked past her to the hallway where my coat used to hang and noticed it was already gone. The empty hook felt like an insult. "You're packing like I'm a stranger," I said quietly. "But I lived here. I built a life here." My voice trembled for a second, not from fear, but from memory. I saw Daniel laughing in this hallway, leaning down to tie my shoelace when I was in a hurry. I saw his hands on the banister, his warm shoulders in the kitchen doorway. This house had heard our jokes and our arguments, our late-night whispers and our tired silences. They were trying to push all that out with boxes and tape. Mark cleared his throat and finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. "It's better this way," he mumbled, like he was repeating something he'd been told. "Mum thinks you should be with your own people." "My own people?" I echoed. The words tasted bitter. Daniel was my people. Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. "Enough," he snapped. "You're not family." The sting of that hit my chest, but I didn't step back. I turned my head slowly, taking them in one by one, and I realized something that made my hands steady. They were acting strong because they thought I had nothing. Grief can make you look weak, and they were counting on that. But Daniel had never been careless with the truth, and he had never been careless with me. "I'm going upstairs," I said, calm and clear. Mark moved forward, blocking the bottom step. "You can't start going through things. We're handling this." I held his gaze and spoke in a voice that didn't ask. "Move." For a moment, he didn't. Then his eyes flicked to Margaret, and I saw the hesitation there, the small crack in his confidence. He stepped aside. I walked up the stairs slowly, not rushing, because I refused to look like I was running from them. Every step creaked the same way it always had, and that familiar sound grounded me. Halfway up, I saw a faint scuff on the wall where Daniel had once carried a bookshelf too close and laughed about it for days. It was proof, in a silly way, that we had lived here, truly lived here. At the top of the stairs, I turned into the small study Daniel loved. It was the quietest room in the house, with a narrow window and a desk that was always tidier than any desk had a right to be. Daniel called it his boring room, but it was where he kept the serious parts of life, bills, documents, letters he didn't want to lose. He had a habit of tapping his pen against his teeth when he was thinking, and I could almost hear it now. I opened the desk drawer, then the second one, and finally the flat wooden drawer underneath, the one that stuck a little in winter. Inside was a folder, thick and neatly labeled in his handwriting. I didn't need to read the title to know what it was. Still, my eyes caught the words, and my stomach tightened with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Daniel had planned for a world without him, and it hurt to see how carefully he'd done it. I ran my thumb along the edge of the folder, then lifted it like it was fragile. When I came back downstairs, the kitchen looked like a storm had passed through it. Boxes were stacked by the door. A roll of tape lay on the counter. Someone had moved the chair Daniel always sat in, pushed it slightly out of place. That tiny detail made me angrier than I expected, because it showed how easily they treated our life like furniture to shift around. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and opened it without drama. "This," I said, "is what you forgot." Margaret's eyes went to the papers, and her mouth tightened. "What is that?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected. Mark leaned in, curious despite himself. Richard stayed back, but he watched closely. "It's Daniel's will," I said. The words came out steady, even though my throat burned. "Signed, witnessed, and filed properly." I turned a page and pointed to the section Daniel had underlined, neat as always, like he wanted it to be impossible to misunderstand. "The house is mine. The accounts are mine. The savings, the investments, everything listed here, mine. He left you personal items, yes, and a few specific gifts. But this home and this life belong to me." For a long moment, nobody spoke. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room and replaced with tension. Mark's face changed first, his confidence slipping as he read. Richard's nostrils flared, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Helen's eyes widened, and she lowered the tape gun slowly, as if she suddenly didn't know what to do with it. Peter took a small step backward, like he was trying to disappear. Margaret stared at the page as if she could force the ink to rearrange itself. "He wouldn't do that," she said at last, but her voice lacked its earlier strength. "He did," I replied. "Because he knew you." The sentence landed harder than I intended, but it was true. Daniel had loved his family in his own complicated way, but he had also seen their sharp edges. He had seen how they measured love in control. He had made sure I wouldn't be left unprotected. Richard took a step toward the table, his voice rising. "We can fight this." "You can try," I said, and I surprised myself by sounding almost tired instead of afraid. "But you'll spend pounds just to be told what this paper already says. The law doesn't care about your anger, and it doesn't care about your pride." Mark swallowed. "Why didn't Daniel tell us?" I looked at him, really looked, and I saw a man who had chosen comfort over courage. "Because he knew you'd do exactly this," I said softly. "And he didn't want me to face it alone." Margaret's gaze snapped up to mine, burning. For a second, I thought she might scream or lunge or rip the pages in half. Instead, she held still, and the silence between us felt like a locked door finally opening. They had changed the locks, yes. They had tried to throw me out, yes. But Daniel had left me something stronger than a key. He had left me a voice that could not be ignored. Margaret's eyes stayed fixed on the papers, but her face shifted, like she was forcing herself to swallow a bitter taste. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards when someone adjusted their stance. A few minutes ago, they had moved through my home like owners. Now they stood like intruders who had been caught mid-step. "This can be challenged," Margaret said at last, and she tried to put steel back into her voice. "I won't be pushed aside by a piece of paper." I didn't argue. I didn't need to. "You can challenge it," I said, "but that won't change what Daniel signed. It will only cost you money and time." I tapped the folder once, not as a threat, but as a reminder. "And you'll still lose." Richard's face turned red. "You're acting like you're stronger than us," he growled. "Like you're above us." I exhaled slowly. "No," I said. "I'm acting like I'm done being treated like I don't belong." The words came out plain, without extra heat, and that calm seemed to irritate him more than shouting would have. People like Richard expected fear. They expected tears. Calm was something they couldn't grab. Mark shifted near the doorway, his shoulders tense. "Maybe we should talk about this," he said, half to Margaret and half to me, as if he wanted a way out that didn't make him look weak. "Maybe there's a middle." There is no middle, Margaret snapped. Her eyes flashed toward him, and he fell silent. Then she looked back at me. You'll leave today, she said, as if repeating it could make it true. That's final. I let my gaze move across the kitchen. The table Daniel built with his own hands, the corner where we kept a small jar for spare change, the window where he used to lean and watch the rain. My grief rose like a wave, but I stood firm. This is my home, I said. I'm not leaving. You are. Helen, who had been hovering near the boxes, cleared her throat softly. Margaret, maybe we should stop, she murmured, but it sounded like she was talking through a wall. Margaret ignored her. Richard stepped forward again, the way men do when they think size can solve problems. We can call people, he said. We can bring someone here. Go ahead, I replied. Call anyone you like. The first person I call will be my lawyer. I kept my voice steady, even though my hands felt like ice. I had never enjoyed confrontation. I wasn't built for it. But I had learned something in the last few weeks of caring for Daniel, something hard and simple. You don't get to choose when you must be brave. Sometimes bravery chooses you. Mark's eyes flicked toward the folder again. I watched him reading in his mind, replaying how sure he'd been earlier. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked like he wanted to say sorry but couldn't find a place to put the word. I walked to the counter and picked up my phone, the same one I'd been clutching since the funeral. My fingers moved without shaking now. I opened a contact and held the screen up where they could see it. The name at the top was Olivia Grant. Beneath it was a short message already drafted, a request for immediate legal action to remove unwanted occupants from my property. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Who is that? A lawyer, I said. And she doesn't care about family titles. She cares about documents and trespassing. Richard scoffed. You wouldn't. I met his stare. I will, I said. And I'll do it today. For a moment, the room felt balanced on a knife edge. Helen looked at Peter, and Peter looked away, suddenly fascinated by the tape roll on the counter. Mark rubbed a hand over his face as if trying to wipe off the last hour. Margaret, though, was still fighting. Not because she believed she was right, but because she didn't know how to be anything else. This house should stay with Daniel's blood, she said, as if she was talking to the ceiling and not to me. A wife is temporary. Blood is forever. My chest tightened, but I didn't give her the reaction she wanted. Daniel chose me, I said. And he chose this. I gestured to the folder. If you loved him, you'd respect what he wanted. That sentence hit her like a slap. For the first time, her expression wavered, and something like fear flickered there. Not fear of me, exactly, but fear of losing the story she had built in her head, one where she always won, one where her son's life belonged to her. Mark finally spoke, his voice low. Mum, we should go. Margaret snapped her head toward him. Don't tell me what to do. Mark swallowed. This is wrong, he said, and it sounded like it cost him something to admit it. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have changed the locks. Silence followed his words, thick and uncomfortable. Richard's stare hardened, but he didn't argue with Mark. He didn't seem sure what power he had left now that the paper was on the table. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply stated what would happen next, because I needed it to be clear. You'll put everything back, I said. Every photo, every book, every piece of clothing. You'll return my spare keys. You'll leave this house, and you won't come back without asking. Margaret's lips pressed together so tightly they almost disappeared. And if I refuse? Then I send that message, I answered, my thumb hovering over the screen. And after that, I file for a restraining order if I have to. I won't enjoy it, but I will do it. Helen let out a small breath, like she'd been holding it for too long. Peter shifted again, uncomfortable, and finally set one of the boxes down with a soft thud, as if surrendering. Mark nodded once, barely. Margaret stood there, trapped between anger and reality. For the first time, she looked older to me. Not powerful. Just tired and stubborn, clinging to control because she didn't know how to live without it. Fine, she said, and the word came out like a stone. But don't think this means you've won. I looked at the doorway, at the new lock they had tried to make mine into theirs, and then back at her. This was never a game, I said. This is my life. And I'm taking it back. And in that moment, I felt the house settle around me again, like it recognized my voice. They didn't leave all at once. It happened in slow, awkward steps, like watching a storm back away from the shore. Helen and Peter were the first to move. Without looking at me, they started carrying boxes back from the driveway, setting them down in the hallway where they had been taken from. The tape gun clicked in Helen's hand as she peeled off strips she had already pressed down, and each sound felt like a small apology she couldn't say out loud. Peter avoided everyone's eyes, but he worked quickly, lifting my books and placing them onto the shelf again, careful this time, as if he finally understood they weren't just objects. Mark walked to the front door and stared at the new lock for a long moment. His shoulders dropped, and something in his face softened, not into kindness, but into regret. He knelt by the door and began to undo what he had done. The screwdriver turned with a steady scrape, metal against metal, and I watched each twist like it was rewriting the last hour. When he pulled the lock free, he placed it on the floor gently, almost respectfully, as if it carried the weight of his mistake. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The sound of him removing that lock said enough. Richard stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, his jaw tight. He looked like a man forced to swallow a truth he didn't like. Several times, I saw him open his mouth as if he wanted to argue again, but no words came out. He was losing control, and for someone like him, silence was the only place left to hide. Margaret remained near the doorway, watching everything with a sharp, frozen stare, as if she could still win by refusing to blink. While they worked, I walked through the house slowly, checking each room the way you check your body after a fall. In the living room, I found my framed photos stacked face down on the sofa, and I lifted them carefully, wiping a thumbprint off the glass. In the kitchen, my mug was sitting in a box like it didn't belong on the shelf, and I placed it back where it always sat. Upstairs, my coat had been folded roughly, and I hung it on the hook by the stairs, restoring that small piece of normal. The house felt bruised, but it was still mine, and that mattered more than I could explain. When Mark finished, he stood and held out a familiar set of keys, the spare keys they had taken from the drawer by the fridge. His hand shook slightly. "Here," he said. It was the first word he'd spoken to me that didn't sound like an order. I took the keys without touching his fingers. "Thank you," I replied, not because I forgave him, but because I wanted the moment to stay clean. If I poured anger into it, it would spill everywhere. Helen and Peter gathered their own things next, moving with quick steps, eager to escape the shame hanging in the air. They mumbled weak goodbyes, and I nodded once. They didn't deserve my softness, but they didn't deserve more damage either. When they stepped outside, the house breathed a little easier, as if the walls themselves were glad to see them go. Richard was next. He walked toward the door with stiff movements, pausing as he passed the hallway mirror. For a second, he glanced at his own reflection and looked almost startled, like he didn't recognize the man staring back. Then he turned away and left without a word, without a look, and without the dignity he thought he carried in with him. The door closed behind him with a firm click that sounded final. Margaret stayed. Of course she did. She stood on the threshold like a judge, as if she was waiting for me to suddenly crumble. Her eyes were cold, but her hands were tight at her sides, and I could see the tiny tremor in her fingers. She wasn't just angry. She was scared. Not of me, exactly, but of the idea that she could no longer control what happened next. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice lower now, less sharp and more poisonous. I looked at her, really looked, and I realized something that steadied me even more. Margaret wasn't grieving Daniel the way I was. She was grieving power. She had lost a son, yes, but she had also lost her grip on the life she believed belonged to her. That grief turned into cruelty because cruelty was the only language she knew to speak when she felt weak. "I already lived through the worst thing," I told her. "Burying Daniel. Everything after that is just noise." My voice didn't shake. It didn't need to. "This house is not yours. And I'm not leaving it." Her face tightened, and for a heartbeat I thought she might say something crueler. Instead, she held my gaze, then turned sharply and stepped outside. She didn't slam the door, but she closed it hard enough to make the glass rattle. I watched her walk down the path, her back stiff, her steps quick, like she was running from the fact that she had lost. When the driveway finally emptied, I locked the door, my old lock back in place, and leaned my forehead against the wood. The silence that followed wasn't lonely in the same way it had been earlier. It was clean. It was mine. I slid down onto the first stair and sat there, letting the stillness settle into my bones. Later, as dusk softened the windows, I opened one of the boxes they had packed in their rush. On top was a photograph of Daniel and me, taken outside a small cafe during a trip we once made in Europe. Daniel's arm was around my shoulders, and his smile looked so alive it almost hurt to see. I held the photo close, pressing it against my chest. "You knew," I whispered, as if he could hear me. "You knew they would try." In my mind, I heard his calm voice the way I remembered it on quiet nights. Not loud, not dramatic, steady. The kind of voice that builds a safe place in your heart. And I understood the real gift he had left me. Not just pounds or dollars, not just a house with walls and doors, but permission to stand firm without feeling guilty for it. I stood up, wiped my face, and walked through the rooms one more time. Not as a visitor, not as someone waiting to be thrown out, but as the owner of my own life. The house still held my sadness, but it also held my strength now. And as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. I felt safe. I felt steady. I felt like the story was still mine to tell.